Measuring heart health on a keto or carnivore diet can be confusing.
How does it look?
My total cholesterol is high, and my LDL is really high.
What does the doctor say?
He says, it's okay.
Ken Berry is the most popular carnivore doctor on YouTube by subscriber count, and not long ago, he said his LDL was 250. That's almost twice as much as would make your doctor nervous. He says he's proud of having extremely high LDL. Paul Saladino is the second most popular carnivore doctor on YouTube, and in 2020, he reported having LDL of 533. That's higher than many doctors have probably ever seen. Yet he believes he's heart healthy and reports a coronary artery calcification score of 0. He also believes his high cholesterol is a good thing in light of his other numbers for heart health. Sean Baker is the third most popular carnivore doctor. Same general story as the other two carnivore doctors I just mentioned, including a coronary artery calcification score of 0. That means he has no calcified plaque in his arteries despite being in his mid-50s and having very high cholesterol, presumably for quite a while. This is an area filled with controversy. Most doctors outside the low-carb space would say you should focus on your LDL cholesterol to measure your heart health. Or they would say you should focus on ApoB, which is essentially a more accurate test for the same thing as LDL. But the best of the newer studies suggest that high LDL and high ApoB are only really a problem if your arteries or cholesterol-carrying particles are damaged. If you're otherwise healthy, the best studies suggest that having high cholesterol actually helps you live longer and healthier. Our previous video was on that, and you can watch it by clicking the link above. I highly recommend watching that video if you'd like to go more deeply into the peer-reviewed science. This video does still touch upon that science, but it doesn't go as deeply. If you'd like to see the references for this video, please look in the description box below. Again, the best of the newer science suggests you actually want high cholesterol if you're otherwise healthy. This is big news for the low-carb and carnivore communities. Emerging science seems to show that people who eat this way become very heart healthy, but some of the traditional labs look scary by traditional measures.
My LDL is really high.
That can scare people into quitting a diet that otherwise helps them, or it can scare them into taking a statin, a cholesterol-lowering drug that arguably does much more harm than good in this context. So this video will teach you how to measure your heart health on a carnivore or low-carb diet. This doesn't mean you should ignore your doctor, but it at least helps you understand what you should be discussing with your doctor, especially if he or she isn't a low-carb specialist. Most of us don't have the luxury of meeting with a low-carb specialist. My wife spent about $5,000 getting tested by a famous low-carb doctor's team. She spent another $5,000 flying there and on the accommodations. She didn't even get any scans, the truly expensive part. Hopefully this video makes it possible for all of us to measure our heart health and at a tiny fraction of the price. Hopefully this video will also help you understand why these tests and numbers mean what they do. Understanding why usually gives us more peace of mind. And we'll end by discussing heart scans that can tell us how much plaquing we already have in our arteries. These scans tend to be the most expensive part, and they serve different purposes. You should know the pros and cons of these scans before you order one. Heart health markers. If possible, our heart health decisions should be based upon peer-reviewed science. Perhaps the best place to look would be a 2021 analysis of the most expensive heart-related study ever. It looked at over 28,000 women and followed them for over 21 years. If you're familiar with this topic from some of our other videos, feel free to skip ahead to this time code. The point of that paper was to determine what causes early heart disease. Early heart disease is more telling. A person can go through many lifestyle changes over the course of a full lifetime. That makes it hard to pinpoint what might have caused heart disease in, say, a 90-year-old. Over a very long lifetime, we can expect many different changes in lifestyle. Maybe a person exercised heavily during certain stages of life, but not others. So if that person gets heart disease, it's hard to identify which parts of his or her lifestyle contributed to it. It makes more sense to look at which things are associated with people getting heart disease quickly. What this most expensive study found is that nearly all the most important risk factors for heart disease point to metabolic syndrome. You might be wondering, what is metabolic syndrome? It seems many keto or carnivore dieters have heard that term but aren't exactly sure what it means. So let's go over that to ensure that these study results make sense. Metabolic syndrome is a group of health problems that come from the body having a hard time processing blood sugar. Its most advanced form is diabetes. Its purest form would be insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is essentially where diabetes starts.
At Johns Hopkins, one of the nation's most prestigious medical institutions, we explain it this way. Most people who have metabolic syndrome have insulin resistance. The body makes insulin to move glucose, also called sugar, into cells for use as energy. Obesity, commonly found in people with metabolic syndrome, makes it more difficult for cells in the body to respond to insulin. If the body can't make enough insulin to override the resistance, the blood sugar level increases, causing type 2 diabetes.
Other byproducts would be increased body fat, especially around the waist, increased blood pressure, high triglycerides, and low HDL cholesterol. Now let's take a closer look at this very expensive study so we can see what we need to measure for our heart health. We see that metabolic syndrome and its related symptoms comprise all the top risk factors except smoking. Diabetes, also known as advanced metabolic syndrome, increased the risk of heart disease by 971%. Insulin resistance, the purest measure of metabolic syndrome, increased the risk by 540%. Diagnosed metabolic syndrome increased risk by 509%. High blood pressure, a symptom of metabolic syndrome, increased risk by 358%. Obesity, yet another symptom of metabolic syndrome, increased risk by 333%. Smoking by 292%. Low HDL, one of the first symptoms of metabolic problems, increased risk by 140%. And high triglycerides, yet another of the first symptoms of metabolic problems, by 114%. By comparison, high LDL cholesterol, the thing your doctor is probably focused on, only increased risk by 40%. The fact that LDL makes a difference, but only a small difference, makes sense. Those newer studies that we discussed, the better studies, they indicate that LDL is only really a problem when it's damaged. And it tends to be damaged by metabolic problems and smoking. So this is what we learned from the most expensive study ever. The most important risk factor for heart problems would be metabolic syndrome in its many different stages. And the best measure, the purest measure of metabolic syndrome would be insulin resistance. Get a test for insulin resistance if you're monitoring your heart health. Unfortunately, the best tests for insulin resistance are hard to do and usually reserved for research. They probably aren't available at your doctor's office. Instead, your doctor might offer to test your fasting blood sugar, also known as fasting glucose. You can even do this test at home without a doctor. Many people who want to monitor their heart health or levels of ketosis buy a reusable at-home testing device for this. I bought a pretty good one called Keto Mojo. It was only about $50 US, and now I can test my blood sugar and ketones whenever I want. If you plan to test yourself more than once, this is probably the most cost-effective way to go. You just have to prick your finger and insert testing strips. To measure your fasting blood sugar, you'd want to test yourself when you haven't eaten in a while, usually right before breakfast. According to the US government, fasting blood sugar over 100 milligrams per deciliter indicates prediabetes, and over 125 indicates diabetes. So you want to be under 100 milligrams per deciliter. That's 5.6 millimoles per liter for those measuring outside the US. To review, the first important test would be fasting blood sugar. You can get an at-home testing device, which is the cheapest way if you want to test yourself repeatedly. And you want to be under 100 milligrams per deciliter or 5.6 millimoles per liter. Or instead of fasting blood sugar, your doctor might offer you an A1C test to see whether you're insulin resistant. But there's a big problem with both of these commonly used tests for insulin resistance, both A1C and fasting blood sugar. Both of them don't show great results for people who are extreme athletes. Extreme athletes will often look pre-diabetic on these tests, even though they're extremely healthy and have great insulin resistance. For example, Dr. Baker, who we already discussed, is the kind of athlete who breaks world sports records for his age categories. His fasting blood sugar and A1C look pre-diabetic, but when you use a more accurate test for insulin resistance, you see that he's very healthy. So, tests for fasting blood sugar and A1C are fine for many, but not for serious low-carb athletes. Perhaps the best test for insulin resistance available to you, especially if you're an athlete, would be a test for fasting insulin. I'll say that again. The most important test available to you is probably fasting insulin. You can purchase this test from a lab for under $40 and without a doctor. Some labs say a normal fasting insulin number is anything under 25, but that's for a sick population. About 88% of the United States suffers from signs of metabolic syndrome, according to published research. The doctors I mentioned above would say you want to stay under 10, or maybe even 5. 5, by the way, would be the equivalent to 35 for our international viewers who would need to perform a units conversion. That makes sense, even though it's not based on hard and fast science. You see, 5 or 10 is well below normal, but we know that people who are normal, at least in a US population, are still, over a long period of time, going to be developing some plaquing in their arteries. They're going to be getting some heart disease. We don't want heart disease, so we want to be well below normal. And a reading of 5 or even 10 is probably going to be good enough to put us substantially below normal and is easily achievable for people who are low-carb dieters. For a benchmark, you might be curious about the fasting insulin numbers for the 3 popular carnivore doctors. They're all around 2 to 3. You can do this. You can get your most important marker, fasting insulin, below 5. Blood pressure and body fat are the next most important signs of metabolic health you might want to monitor. But you probably already know quite a bit about them. There isn't much knowledge about these 2 things that would be unique to the low-carb community, so it doesn't make much sense for us to spend very much time talking about that in this video. Besides, blood pressure and body fat probably aren't the most important measurements compared to some of the other things that we'd be looking at in this video. For example, you might be overweight even though you've lost a bit recently. You just have more to lose. Or you might have higher blood pressure or gain some weight for reasons that have nothing to do with poor heart health. Most low-carb dieters see their blood sugar get better within a few months, but for those who don't, it's often because they're nervous about being tested. Or you might get worried about putting on some fat when you've actually just put on some muscle. And for some people, putting on a little more fat is actually healthy. If you're hoping to learn whether you are particularly heart healthy, it might be better to skip past blood pressure and body fat and look at the next 2 markers instead. Look at HDL cholesterol and triglycerides. You get these in virtually any basic blood lipid panel. You can even order this basic panel for about $20. Arguably, high HDL and low triglycerides are the best markers of extremely good heart health. If you think that you're in pretty good heart health, but you want to confirm, looking at these 2 markers is probably where you want to focus. But being in the normal range probably isn't good enough. A very high-tech study showed that almost half the people in the normal reference range for all normal risk factors, including LDL cholesterol, still show evidence of heart disease. On the other hand, a recent study presented by Dave Feldman suggests very good HDL and triglyceride numbers will actually halt the progression of heart disease for people who are low-carb dieters. The people with very high HDL and low triglycerides seem to halt their plaque progression even if their cholesterol was sky high. So what HDL and triglyceride numbers are we looking for? Dr. Ovadia is a heart surgeon and the author of the #1 heart health book on Amazon. He also eats a carnivore diet, by the way. He often recommends getting your ratio of triglycerides to HDL down to 2 to 1. Arguably, that's not good enough because it's still pretty close to the normal reference range. Many low-carbohydrate dieters manage to get their ratio down to almost 1 to 1. Some go even below that, as Dave Feldman's research showed. To qualify for Feldman studies, people have to be lean mass hyperresponders. In part, that means they need to eat a low-carb diet and end up with a ratio under 1 to 1. But lean mass hyperresponders are extreme examples. Instead, let's look at the carnivore doctors at the very beginning of this video. Dr. Berry reported numbers close to lean mass hyperresponders, presumably meaning close to a ratio of 1:1. In 2020, Dr. Saladino reported a ratio of 1.2:1. And in 2023, Dr. Baker reported a ratio of 1.35:1. Plaque scans. So far, we've been looking at markers for heart health, particularly blood tests. We looked at what are arguably the three most important blood test markers for measuring heart health if you're a low-carb dieter. Look at your insulin resistance, particularly as measured with a fasting insulin test. You want to get your number below 5, maybe below 10. Look at your triglycerides, which you want to be low, and look at your HDL cholesterol, which you want to be high. Ideally, you would want your ratio of triglycerides to HDL to be below 2:1 and perhaps as low as 1:1. But those blood tests only give us health markers. Markers are good because they can tell us where we're headed, whether it looks like what we're doing is making us healthier. But they can't tell us where we're already at. They can't look inside our bodies and tell us what our heart disease is already like, how much plaque we already have built up in our arteries. To do that, we need artery calcification scans or soft plaquing scans. Unless you have advanced staged heart disease, there are probably two main scans you might be considering. The first is a CACS, or coronary artery calcification scan. The plaque in your arteries starts out soft and gradually hardens or calcifies. As the name suggests, a coronary artery calcification scan tells us how much of the older calcified plaquing you have, but it won't tell us how much of the newer soft plaquing you might have. Thankfully, a CAC score can still be very useful to determine if you've built up plaquing over the course of the last several years. Here's a 2021 peer-reviewed scientific article about it. It explains, the calcium score in the arteries is a reliable predictor of heart attacks. It has become a widely available, accurate, and dependable tool for determining the risk of heart attacks. The article goes on to explain that CAC scores are very good to determine if a person who otherwise seems to present no risk factors is nonetheless at risk of having a heart attack, whether they have some plaque built up. But in people who have advanced disease, a CAC scan becomes meaningless. In other words, this test for calcification is for people who aren't sure whether they have any plaque buildup yet. If you have a score of 0 on the scan, it means that your likelihood of having a heart attack is negligible. It's very close to 0. The scan would have successfully determined that you're safe. If you have a high score, perhaps in the hundreds, this test isn't very good at determining what risk you might have. You'd need additional testing for that. Most people don't worry about getting a CAC scan until they're in their 40s. But if you're worried about building up plaque faster than normal, you might want to get one at an earlier age. And once you've gotten yourself tested, doctors don't recommend getting retested for 3 to 5 years after that. The scan is not the tool to determine whether your new diet is working over the short run. New plaquing will not be calcified and will not show up in this type of scan. And regardless of how good your current lifestyle is, it doesn't appear you can ever reduce your calcification score. Your CAC score will not go down, even if you're living the most perfect lifestyle imaginable. In fact, your CAC score might even go up on a healthy diet. It might go up because you're on a statin. Statins cause soft plaquing to calcify more quickly, for better or worse. Or your CAC score might go up because the soft plaquing you've built up before the diet isn't being removed, and it's staying in your system and hardening under your new healthy diet. As a side note, if you want to remove your soft plaquing, exercise. All that means it isn't worthwhile to get frequent CAC scans. It's not worth the additional radiation exposure, and it's not worth the financial cost. That cost, by the way, is usually a few $100s US at your doctor's office, though it can be double that much. That's a lot of money, but nonetheless inexpensive for a scan. The relatively inexpensive cost is the main reason that people would opt for a CAC scan versus the next option we're going to talk about. The second scan you might be considering is probably a CT angiogram. A CT angiogram is generally considered a better scan. It measures the total amount of plaquing, both soft and calcified, all in one scan. Researchers like Dave Feldman are using CT angiograms to track the plaquing people build up year to year. It's arguably the best scan available. This is the scan that you would want to use if you're trying to track whether, under your new health regime or diet, you're still building up plaque by measuring yourself from year to year. But it's not better than a CAC scan in every way. A CT angiogram gives you a higher dose of radiation than a CAC scan. A CT angiogram involves doctors injecting a special dye into your blood. That might scare off some people. And a CT angiogram usually costs more, much more, often well over $1,000 in the United States. But we've seen some offers in the $400 to $600 range online, so you might want to shop around. Obviously, this isn't an exclusive list of the things that you might want to track for your heart health. It's just what this channel believes are important, especially for low-carb dieters. If you have other suggestions for the viewers, feel free to address them in the comment section. Similarly, please comment on the things that you would like this channel, Deusai, to address in future videos. The channel is trying to address the most urgent topics first, and it's helpful knowing what you think. Thanks for watching and commenting.